Morning. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Glad to see you here bright and early on day 2 of the summit. I trust everyone had a great time last night. I have to admit, I came down this morning to go into the gym and I looked over to where the party had been and everything was completely empty. I'm like, what the hell happened? It must have been some party. But anyway, this morning I'm here to give you a bit of a practical perspective on the environmental markets, Allegro and system integration. I'm with the Structure Group. We're the premier consulting and software firm in the global energy industry. We focus solely on energy so we can keep up with those the changing markets and how they affect our clients. Obviously, one of those markets is the environmental markets, including obviously emissions and renewables. We have extensive knowledge of the processes required to support our clients' business operations. We take a very pragmatic approach to delivering our projects. You'll find that, if I were to walk in your door, my first thing would be, guys, in this project, common sense will prevail. Basically, we're not going to get involved in politics. We're here just to get a system or a project completed. We were founded about 12 years ago. We're headquartered in Houston. We have more than 150 consultants and developers across North America. And I'm pleased to say that recently we were the recipient of Energy Risk's 2010 Advisory Firm of the Year award. And above and beyond that, and in particular, we are an Allegro partner. So we have done a lot of work with Allegro over the years. We continue to do a lot of work with Allegro, and we expect to do a lot of work in the future with Allegro. Quick disclaimer, this presentation started out, it was going to be a breakout session. So it was originally intended to be rather longer, somewhat more detailed, a little more technical, a lot of information contained therein. As I started looking through it, I said, I don't really want to take out a lot of this information because it is kind of useful. So it will be in the presentation. We will probably gloss over a number of these slides. I won't get into a lot of the nitty-gritty details, but the presentation will be available for download. Once you get back to your offices, you'll be able to download it from Allegro's site. Give you a quick overview of the agenda, of what we're going to go through here. Give you a quick overview of the emissions and the REC markets, look at the market and regulatory outlook. We'll look in a little more detail at the emissions 8.1 component within Allegro. Give you an idea of kind of some of the work we've done in the environmental markets. I always like to include a slide with several websites where people can go to find out more detailed information about the particular topic that I'm presenting on, and then some contact details at the very end. Should also mention we do have a booth outside, so if you want to stop by and talk about any of these things in more detail, we're here to for exactly that purpose, as a matter of fact. So, without much more ado, some of this stuff you may well be familiar with. If you're not, this is obviously not being a conference per se. It's much more of a summit type of thing. I don't know that we'll really do Q&A, and we don't have a lot of time to do that. So as I said, if you do have questions, I'll be at our booth all day or flitting around between the various conference sessions, so feel free to stop by or stop me or any of my colleagues to chat about any of this stuff in more detail. But basically, for those who are not too up to speed on what this is all about, emissions are chemical pollutants on a large scale. Stuff that goes up smokestacks for the most part, comes out of tailpipes, comes out of livestock farming, etc. Some of the emissions types that we see: carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, methane, mercury, particulates, those sorts of things. As you're probably aware, the EPA restricts emissions of certain pollutants, notably NOx and SOx. Those things have been in force for quite some time in the US, and potentially CO2 in the future. And I'll talk a little bit about where things are legislatively, or not legislatively at the moment in the US. And so what you've got is basically a series of areas where they've said, okay, there's basically too many pollutants going into the atmosphere in this particular region. Something needs to be done about it. Globally, we have the Kyoto Accord, which expires in 2012. It governs the award and trading of CO2 offsets and reduction certificates on a global basis. The US is not a signatory to Kyoto, nor is Australia, two of the larger polluters in the world. Now, for those who, whether you agree or not that CO2 is a pollutant, it has been designated as one by the EPA does have the power to regulate it. Whether you agree or not, don't agree, whether it is, in fact, a pollutant is a separate matter. The fact of the matter is, at some point or other, we may well be faced with some sort of carbon regime that we're going to have to deal with, and we're going to have to trade through. To comply with any of these limits that are enforced by the various agencies, the producers of emissions are required by law to reduce or restrict their yearly emission tonnage. I had one client, for example, a few years ago in the UK where they had an issue where as they started to exceed their pollution, their emissions limits, they actually had to shut down for the rest of the year. So we had a pretty tricky task to try and figure out how can we optimize their production of electricity throughout the year to basically maximize the market opportunities, meet their load, and yet still be generating electricity on December 31st of the year. It was an interesting challenge from a system perspective. What this does, though, is it puts a price on emissions instruments, which generally trade just below the value of any type of penalty that you might have to pay for not complying. Companies are awarded these. They can bid at auction. It very much depends on the nature of the market, how exactly those instruments come about. And they can use those to offset their emissions. Alternatively, they can shut down or reduce their emissions. If they actually manage to reduce emissions below their allowable limits, they may be granted reduction certificates or additional allowances or credits, which they can then use to sell to other people. Companies that need credits or allowances obviously have to buy them from those who have reduced emissions or are otherwise long on allowances. They're often governed by a cap-and-trade type system. Kind of got a little bit of a bad name with all the sort of political situation that's been going on. But here in the US, cap and trade for NOx and SOx has been in existence since the mid-90s. On CO2, we're starting to see it. We see it globally. But basically, as I said, you got a limit. You've got to stay below the limit. If you don't, you have to pay a fine. You have to have some sort of certificate allowance credit that you can use to offset your to offset the overage, as it were. Increasingly, what you're seeing is voluntary participation. It's become a big marketing opportunity. Again, by way of disclaimer, I should say that I'm actually going to be a participant in these markets personally. I just signed an agreement to put in a solar field in my backyard in New Jersey, which if anyone is familiar with the way that the markets work, and I'll get into this in more detail later, but New Jersey solar renewable energy credits are trading at pretty astronomical levels and are likely to stay that way for at least the next 3 to 5 years. So it just made total financial sense for me to do this. But as I was saying about voluntary participation, I was walking through Times Square about a month ago with my 6-year-old son, and he said, we're pretty conservation-minded at home, and he said, Dad, they're using a lot of electricity here, aren't they? Which, if anyone's ever been to Times Square, I'm sure you can attest. And then I turned around and I looked, and there was a big, huge, great Coca-Cola sign, and at the bottom it said, "Powered by green wind energy." I said, well, that's exactly an example of how people are using the voluntary carbon markets or the renewable energy markets as a marketing type tool to say, hey, look at how green we are. We purchase, either renewable energy, we purchase certificates, aren't we great? So they're actually using it as a promotional type of instrument. And this is now where we get into, there's a whole mix of local, state, federal, regulatory agencies involved, and it creates this huge alphabet soup of instruments. I mean, basically, if you can think of permutations on the letters C, E, and R, you've probably got some kind of instrument in this market. Increasingly as well, what we see is the letter V as well for voluntary, especially on the carbon side of things. But you've got things like emission allowances for like NOx and SOx, certified emission reduction credits. These are the traded under the Kyoto Accord, called CERS, emission reduction credits. Those govern things like methane, various other chemical pollutants such as dry cleaning fluid and solvents and that type of thing, particulates, and those sorts of things. Those are quite often regulated by very, very localized agencies. So you can imagine from a tracking and trading perspective, this creates all sorts of complexities because now you've got these fragmented markets, fragmented instruments. They're not terribly fungible. You can't really trade them, across the jurisdictions and that type of thing. It creates all sorts of headaches from a system perspective. But in the absence of a current federal carbon standard in the US, we've got a lot of regional schemes emerging.